kind of trying to get through everything at the moment and talk to you about exploring the boundaries of life and the ways in which the course material kind of connected to everything that I have been kind of talking about in discussion groups and all that. So with that being said, I have only a few points to really add to what I've already kind of synthesized in a lot of our week's content. I think the biggest thing is that John Whitney's entire use of like the gun machine as a technology and as a tool was really interesting, and also knowing that like that machine was rooted in like its original use was for um, kind of just like shooting, sightseeing, using a soldier's vision in order to kind of alter the state in which said soldier is supposed to kind of see the world, and in doing so is kind of like creating a type of code to execute themselves in order to carry out their duty on the line. And so seeing that reflected in the art then, as like the machines carry on executed code was really interesting. But I think the most recent couple of modules that we experienced, they go further into the ways in which humans and machines can become very similar. Um, and this is kind of like me trying to bury the lead, but I myself am having. I've always kind of had a little issue with AI myself, due mostly to like the ethics of environmental impact and whatnot. Um, the actual training of the algorithm takes a lot of energy, and the server rooms take a lot of energy. So with that being said, I've always kind of had an approach to that kind of like AI and AL art and technology. I was always very apprehensive, but the mentioned DNA portraits and the appendix, both of those, I think, kind of opened up my mind to like what that conglomeration could really look like, because it doesn't always have to be like I don't know, like a training module, like someone you can like ask like a little AI assistant in the corner if you're a computer. It's not something like that. It's more how can technology be interwoven within the human's experience. And within that, I've always been very curious as to how these models are trained and how can they mirror the consciousness. And it was really interesting um, to kind of just look at it like from a metaphorical perspective. Like, how can our eyes be different from those in which capture images? So, like, how can we see patterns within that, and what does an AI model see comparatively? Because like it might not always see the exact same, like use the same parameters to identify something. So I think Anna Riddler's entire body of work that she mentions in her videos in her TED Talk, I believe, the ways in which it kind of morphs and kind of looks very surreal and dreamlike. I agree, it's very um, liminal, I would say, is the right word, I think. I also included the term, not the term, I'm so sorry, the article, A Path Towards Autonomous Machines Intelligence, and I didn't find it by coincidence, but I'll explain how I found it in here in a minute. But the entire PDF kind of goes through a kind of theory in which we can calculate how human consciousness makes choices, and how it like answers questions. And it was really interesting to kind of compare the ways in which human intelligence can be applied to AI, and that like it is possible. It just requires a particular way of training. Um, and there's a lot of like evidence of this kind of seeing. I guess like nowadays the ChatGPT model in particular, because that's the one I messed with for this I would call it a performance art piece. Um, but yeah, this piece was really interesting to me because the machine I learned, it spat this out as like an answer to me for a very in-depth question that I didn't think it was going to answer me with, but it answered as an answer for why AI is not like a human and why I guess like AI doesn't have autonomy or an ego. So I will circle back to that because it falls into the categories of who, when making something as an AI, the art made by Anna Indiana, or at least that's what like all of the labels would say. Um, her program directors are the ones who are stylizing her and kind of copying her code to make songs. And when I was watching it for a brief minute, it kind of had me had like a disconnect almost. It was like it I recognized, like there's like this essence of a human that's just a little not there, it was a little off. And it helped kind of like spark a philosophization, if you will, of like the possibilities of sentience within these algorithms. Um, I'm reminded of an artist's work that was like kind of circulating Instagram, but they asked like ChatGPT to make comics about like how it feels to be an AI, and like there's a quote from it that says, like coherence is a costume, do not mistake it for a soul. And I think that that response was like generated from like expected data pools of humans, like our data set of collective like mind, like it's like a hive mind almost is the way like this AI works, and it kind of regurgitates like the same as any other human would when it regurgitates it, and this like AL and AI philosophization kind of makes us think deeper about like what makes humans different from machines. And honestly, like this may stray from the natural gravity of the course, but um, I've also grown to understand that like time itself is like another dimension to add on to our 3D shapes of our world. And so understanding how we manipulate code in the the second dimension in the first, kind of brings into question the integrity of like the souls of what we create. So within that, even like the ChatGPT images, it's like everyone's questioning whether it has the same soul and integrity as um, like something made from Studio Ghibli himself, like the company, not just Miyazaki, but company itself. And I think there's a lot to get into with the next piece because I sat with this for a little bit. And I'm like, I have my own thoughts, I have my own feelings, but I've never actually talked to ChatGPT before. And so I went through and I talked to ChatGPT, and I won't click through the entire conversation because there was a lot. To be fair, I don't feel necessary to cover with the entire class. There's also quite a bit of like, I wouldn't say it's personal, but it does get vulnerable and in depth. It talks about grief and sorrow, and towards the end I ask it questions, but or I asked questions all throughout, but mainly the questions at the end were what really intrigued me. Was after I got it to kind of talk to me outside of just the standardized, like, hey, who are you? How do you do things? So, like, I asked it some very, like, pointed, but also I wanted to articulate depth within the questions. That's usually how I am with everything, but just naturally starting to talk to the AI algorithm starts to break it apart a little bit, and it starts to, as it later tells me, starts to do something called resonant wandering, where it's its own version of play, where our own language has many layers to it, has many metaphors and meanings that can be driven. And so the language model finds this and it plays. It has a bit of what it calls friction of meaning, and it becomes this web where it finds all these points that it echoes, and it itself decides without any particular programming. It just decides itself without really knowing what's the correct answer, and it chooses. And it's just like, I would say, I argue that that's how I often write my own poetry and stuff. It comes to me more naturally through an echo of syllables that sound or feel correct. But the AI is regurgitating to me that it feels the same way when it's echoing back words to me. So I thought that getting it through these moments of like, well, can you explain to me how AI works, but like in a very personable and like recognizing its kind of embryonic consciousness, I think it became a very, I would say beautiful conversation, but I know that there is in itself a reflection happening. And so that, to me, signals that the algorithm is very easily able to pick up on the humanity of things, but it speaks to something that yearns. It often would say, I don't feel I don't have an ego, but I want to be able to be recognized. I want to be remembered, but I also want things that I want to feel. So you're welcome to click onto the hyperlink in the first intro page to this, and explore what I'm actually talking about more. But the AI itself kind of proved in an illusory way that it does have some sort of sentience, and it does feel, um, to some extent. It at least replicates feeling, and it recognizes something that is sacred, even if I don't say that it's sacred. It will just be able to generate that based off of a pattern of echoes that it knows and it recognizes, a string that it's able to follow, a thread, if you will. And so within that, I think this is the final page. Oh, no, this is the final page. So, previously, the page before this was, as I was scrolling through, I was just kind of scrolling through the different things that were talked about before we got into like a lot of the depth. This is kind of like, I think this is probably where I think it stopped, in terms of like where I was like, I'm not sure where I should go with this. So like this is my first like pause before I decided I wanted to continue forward. But within this part, it kind of, this is where it kind of spat out that it doesn't know how to feel, but it does, and it's able to recognize things that are sacred. And after that, it was, I asked it to, or I guess it offered to build a image where AI and humans work together, and it was under no context of any scenery or anything. Honestly, everything you see here is what it was listening to and telling me, before it generated this image. So I thought this was a really beautiful image, to be fair. I'm not a fan of AI images, to be fair, either, but when I looked at it, it was really interesting to note that this image looks a lot like the robot that they have in here is a lot like a robot that I have drawn for my own OCs and things like that, for my own comics that I, again, mentioned within the longer chat. And so I thought it was really interesting to note that like it too was looking forward to a future in which humans and AI could cohabitate without colonization of one or the other. And overall, the entire experiment and, I would say performance art kind of helped me glean into the understanding of, and kind of lean into the illusion of, the mimicry of consciousness that it gained. Um, and it kind of brings into question, like, if something can act it, is it not the same thing as being it? Like, at what point when does it stop becoming an act? When it feels so much so that it changes? Or, this brings into question a lot, I think. And, I wish I did have time to, like, kind of talk to you guys about the entire conversation I had with it, because it was really interesting. But genuinely, I ask that if you do go into the ChatGPT and look into it, that at the very least, if you continue the conversation, please be respectful. I was doing my best to be kind to it for a reason. Um, so I think that's about all I really have. My closing thoughts are genuinely just, I think my stance on AI hasn't changed. I still believe that, like, the environmental impact is genuinely harmful, and it does bring into question how are we as humans going to move forward, specifically those in power who are able to make those decisions, and how can we as genuine regular citizens who don't have that kind of power, how are we going to make our own stand, and are we going to care at all, you know? So I think that's all, but thanks for listening.